All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today. We are members of KCIT. My name is Melissa McDermott, and I am the Training and Outreach Specialist. I come from a victim services background, and I have 5 years experience working in domestic violence, where I was a children's advocate. I worked on the hotline and also in our office, and now have worked for KCIT for the past 2 years, helping with the state response to trauma across the state. And we have Donna Welsh here, who is our coordinator.
Hi, yeah, I'm Donna Welsh. I'm the program coordinator for KCIT, and I have about 20 years experience predominantly in child welfare, but I've been working with NOVA and KCIT for 2 years with victim services and providing victim service care throughout Pennsylvania. And I also had domestic violence experience as well. I worked for about 8 years as a community member for a domestic violence organization.
All right, thanks, Donna. So if you can just bring up our slide. It is weird not to see anyone, but
I know, I'm not used to this.
we will proceed.
Yes, we will. Sorry about that.
Can you go back to the first slide?
Sure. Sorry about this. It's not.
All right, no worries. Okay, so this session is talking about the services that we offer at KCIT and our emphasis on community care. And we'll talk about how that's different from self-care and why it is important and not to be overlooked. All right, so the problem, right, is trauma and stress. And that is the reason why KCIT exists, why interventions are needed, and why self-care and community care are crucial. So there are a lot of different ways that folks describe trauma, but we have a definition at KCIT that we work from that we'd like to share with you all, so we have a common working language throughout the session. So this is also a definition that Bessel van der Kolk, the psychologist out of Boston, uses to describe trauma. So it is when trauma occurs when both your internal and external resources are completely inadequate to cope with an external threat. So that can sound a bit jargony, so we'll put it into context. So normally, when stresses or things come up in your life, you have these resources that you draw from that help buffer your response to that stress. Something that you draw on for comfort, for strength. And these things help you to bounce back, to rebuffer. It's a natural part of being human and living. And unfortunately, trauma is a natural response too, but it is when we become stuck in those places that it becomes maladaptive. So I'll talk a little bit about what our internal and external resources are, just so we can get like a real depth of what this trauma really means. So any of our internal resources are the things that we draw on that we don't need anyone else for. No other resources outside of ourselves or dependence on anything. We can get to them whether we're in our car or whether we're in a classroom. I like to tell people to imagine yourself in an elevator. If you were alone without anything else, you would still have these resources that you could access to provide calm and strength to yourself. And examples of this could be positive self-talk, affirmations, movement that you find calming or discharging, prayer, and then some things that are maybe a little bit less tangible that would exist outside of that elevator metaphor are creating routines for yourselves and also boundaries. These are things that can provide calm and help you to feel safe. And then conversely, external resources are those things that you do depend on and that are not inside of you. And neither one of these are better than the other, and we need a mix of both. And you'll see that our external resources correlate more with community care, while our internal resources correlate more with our own self-care. So those external resources, maybe like our friends, our family, counselors, maybe a spiritual community or religious community. They don't have to be like quote unquote healthy or great, good things for us, just anything that gets us through the day. Maybe it's music, nature, food, medication. These are example of external resources. But trauma really wipes out all of those things and says, that's not enough for this situation. It is so overwhelming that for that time, it is all of your resources combined are completely inadequate to cope with an external threat. The threat was just too much, and your system could not take it in or draw upon resources to cope. Okay. So here we have a picture of a piece of artwork done by Picasso that is called Guernica. And I just wanted to see if folks had the ability to unmute and to just get people's reactions to what feelings are conjured up by looking at this image. I don't know if you guys have the ability to unmute, but feel free to just.
If you don't have the ability to unmute, feel free to put things in the chat.
Overwhelmed, anxiety. Thank you so much. Disconnect. That's a big one. Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, so chaos, pain, chaos. Thank you. Anguish. These are all, very present in the painting. Thank you guys for sharing. And that is the big thing, right? Everyone is like, if you look at each individual face, you'll see some kind of chaos and pain. And then you'll see that no one is looking at one another. And a lot of people picked up on that disconnection. And the reason why we show this is because that is the foundational hallmark of how trauma gets stuck in communities and in ourselves. It's when we are like this painting, when we are disconnected, when we are not being seen, being mirrored, or taken into account. We are alone. We are in chaos, and we are disconnected. And of course, this can happen amongst a spectrum. Peter Levine, who is a trauma psychologist, says trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside with the absence of an empathic witness. So it's like those things that get stuck because we have not been truly seen or mirrored in our suffering or in our hurt. So being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of healing trauma and our mental health. And this just reiterates it. Trauma is not only the occurrence of the events and experiences like many of us attend to with our clients, whether it be domestic violence, sexual assault, a victim of another crime. where maybe their experience was too much, too fast, too soon, something that took away their power and control, that invaded their agency. But it can also be the absence of love, safety, trust, belonging, and connection that was not there for them when that event happened, or perhaps earlier in life, which did not allow them the resilience to kind of be able to bounce back. Trauma healing is a natural part of our body and our human nature, but it really does need human connection, love, and belonging for us to be able to tap into our own natural healing processes. So we talked about resources. We talked about our internal and our external ones. And our external resources are those that exist in the community, right? Our friends, our family, our communities. And when trauma happens, these resources are taxed or perhaps overwhelmed as well. So this can weaken emotional ties within the community. What can happen is there can be a loss of key leaders, access to other community resources and faith-based venues. I know that, a great example of this is what we've been going through as a shared global community over the past 2 years with COVID-19. And everyone having to face their own emotional ties that have been weakened due to a lack of access to community, to the normal ways we experience community, and having fear kind of not only the anxiety of getting sick, but just of others' beliefs kind of really weakened the emotional ties that that really do build community connection and healing. And then it can increase cultural tensions, as we've seen with COVID-19 and other political conflict of the past 2 years. There really is this divisiveness between folks, and this is present anytime a trauma or a big threat happens to a community. Okay. So why community care is important is because there's always this interdependent nature between people that we sometimes, especially in our individualist culture, don't think about all that often. But there's always this ripple effect. What happens somewhere is always affecting the larger community and vice versa. So it moves back and forth. We hear phrases like "it takes a village," and this is important when we think about crimes and traumas that happen in a community, because so often the model for healing right now is to go seek individual services, but it kind of doesn't help the systemic nature of how these crimes and shootings and traumas are taking place, and it can lead people to feel lonely in accessing their healing. So we just want to highlight the interdependent nature, and that depending upon the scale of the trauma or the event, the effects of how the community is affected can be more overt or covert. So, like, for example, with COVID-19, it was very overt how that chaos highlighted how interdependent we were on one another, right? People started to talk about and to recognize how we need food service workers, how important they are. And it highlighted these things that we thought we were just so independent about before, don't need anyone else. Chaos and trauma do highlight our interdependent nature and how we need one another to survive. And that is why community care is important. So systemic trauma. This picture on the right is called the pair of aces. And I'm sure most of you in this room has heard of adverse childhood experiences before. What you may not have heard of is the term adverse community environments. And this came out of George Washington University with Dr. Ellis. She created this image to show that trauma and adverse experiences are the outcome of a systemic and community environment that allows trauma to occur, or maybe even designed for traumatic incidences to occur. So why community care is important is because self-care does not address the roots, the systemic issues. It can help with symptoms, as we see, as the adverse childhood experiences or the traumas that are the outcomes of things, but we really want to get to the root, right, of the issue. And when the root is what is happening in our systems, then community care can start to address that, right? Because we're working together on more of a systemic issue than saying each person needs to just work on themselves. And we're not trying to say that self-care isn't important. It is very important. However, it is only one piece of the puzzle. And if we eliminate one or the other, we don't have the full picture of wellness of what is needed for individuals and our society to be able to heal and help one another. So some of these adverse community environments are things like, lack of opportunity, poverty, housing discrimination, community disruption. All of these things are going to clearly result in trauma for folks if they don't have those resources, those internal and external resources that are buffers that we talked about in the beginning. Okay, so as we just mentioned, for wellness, for wholeness, for healing, we need both self-care and community care. So we want to talk about what both of those mean, but also just, I love the definition that the World Health Organization uses for wellness. And it talks about how it's not just the absence of disease, but it is the state of complete physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. We can think about connection, right, as part of our spiritual well-being, and how community care is so important with feeling connected. So for self-care, we talk about it as the practice of taking time to listen, identify, and prioritize what our needs are. When we don't do that, we become run down and we are not able to be our full authentic selves. We risk becoming burnt out, and we aren't able to really take place and contribute to community care, because community care is kind of like a collective bank. We withdraw when we need it and we give when we can, so that it's always there for someone. But we can't participate in community care if we don't also take care of ourselves. So there's a lot of talk about self-care. It's very trendy right now, but the important thing to realize is it's not just about comfort. Comfort is an important part of self-care, but it's also about responsibility. It's about balancing the needs of what would be good for yourself right now and what is good for your future self. So right now, I may really just want to watch Netflix. But if I don't prepare for my presentation, then I will be stressed and upset with myself. You guys all know this, right? We're always balancing those needs with one another, and it's not all one or the other, because if we're too rigid, then we're not giving ourselves the ease and comfort we need. But if we're too comfortable, then we're not thinking about our future self. So it's always that balance, and it's really difficult because it's something that no one else can tell us, and something that we need to live into to really find out what works for us. So there are real limits of self-care. And Nikita said, shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail people. Think about how invalidating it is if you are drowning, shouting for help, and someone says, take care of yourself. I'm sure we've all maybe felt that way in this culture of self-care and individualism. And what kind of shame that a drowning person might feel when they're told to take care of themselves. You can't. You are literally drowning. But nonetheless, that is what we do. So we want to be careful, and really see where people are at, so that we aren't causing them to feel shame, and we are not denying the nature that of our social and cooperative nature with one another. So the limits of self-care again is we are social creatures. It is part of our humanity to need validation and support from one another. That is how our brain is wired. We need to be mirrored, and we need to be seen and heard. When we feel shame about not being able to ask for help, it leads to more isolation, and it actually furthers our trauma, right? We feel less and less like we are worthy, and our resources become more and more diminished the less we're able to ask for help and reach out to others. So this may start to make us feel lonely, and it's important to know that loneliness is not just about being alone, but actually it's about the connections that you have. And if you feel that the connections that you have in your life are not enough, that is when you feel lonely. So Vivek Murthy, who was the Surgeon General, said during his years of caring for patients, the most common condition he saw was not heart disease or diabetes, but loneliness. So that is a huge statement to make for someone who is charged with the nation's health, and saying that the emotional health of Americans was the biggest disease and the biggest unaddressed needs. So that is really showing how important community care is for Americans, especially right now when loneliness is an epidemic.
Especially with COVID.
Yes. So community care is the recognition of the undeniable cooperative and social nature of human beings. So we use our privilege to be there for each other in various ways, right? We give what we can. It's not about overexerting ourselves, but when everyone gives a little bit, we realize how rich we really are as a community. There are always creative solutions when folks are able to come together, and it can seem like in times of threat that there's real scarcity, right? That there's not enough to go around. But it seems like when folks come together, there is so much more that is really possible when we just give what we can. It kind of goes back to the parable some of you may be aware of like the loaves and the fishes, right? When people come together, much more is possible. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs shows that love and belonging is a real core need for individuals. And without it, we're not able to rise above to that next level of having self-esteem, of having strength and freedom and respect. So community care is an undeniable need. If we're not experiencing that sense of belonging, and Vivek Murthy talks about 3 different areas of connection and where you can feel loneliness. And so one is intimacy, one is friendships, and one is the larger community. And we need all 3. And if one is missing, we can experience loneliness. So another reason that community care is important for the individual. And that just really highlights this key term of connection. And what connection really is that closeness, that bond that we experience with someone. It really does reduce a sense of threat in the brain. It allows your shoulders to drop and to feel that you do not have to be on guard, that you feel valued, that you feel seen, and that there's trust, right? Trust allows that guard to go down, and it helps you to heal. And Vivek Murthy, in his book, if any of you are interested in it, it is called Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. He talks about how in other countries and in the UK, doctors are starting to provide prescriptions that are social prescriptions of being with people, and how that is healing in and of itself. And there's a real precedence for community care that we don't seem to always think about as a culture or as a society now. And it's things like peer support services, right? We have things that already exist, like 12-step groups that all support each other in their shared struggles. And then we can go back to thinking about how we evolved and how we lived in villages and everyone really depended upon one another. And then in the age of industrial revolution, it really started to separate us out into these nuclear families, which isn't as natural for how our brains and our bodies are wired. So it is really important to tap back into the community, to tap back into the village that we evolved in and grew into. And then there's just the difference between the individualist and collectivist culture. Neither one is wrong or right, but you want to remember that in individualist culture, we are really tempted to think that we can do it alone, and we are focusing less on the community. So we want to remember that community is important, and especially because we exist in this culture, that we need to always be looking where we are lacking and going back to the community to make sure that healing is a comprehensive, and we're getting those internal and external resources.
So just for a second, before we jump into where we're gonna now really get into the meat of KCIT and our program that we provide through KCIT, does anyone have any questions or comments they'd like to share? If you could check on the chat room, that'd be great.
I am.
Okay. So now we're going to move into what we do here at KCIT. First, to talk about, when we talk about KCIT, now I say KCIT, it's Keystone Crisis Intervention Team. I'm going to refer to that as KCIT. And KCIT provides what we call group crisis interventions. And we refer to that as a GCI. So KCIT's been providing GCIs for the state of Pennsylvania for over 20 years now. And what we do is we provide this service to communities that have been impacted by crime and trauma ensues. And we've learned a lot about what the benefits are for providing this type of care, as well as some of the goals that we infused with that to really gain more from the benefits. So we refer to the GCI as a secondary response because the communities have your first responders. They come in right after a critical incident occurs and they make the community safe. And then the community is sort of left to try to fend for themselves. And Melissa talked about that so beautifully, like a lot of, just basically you're on your own. You can get individual therapy. You could try to create a group experience. So KCIT fills that gap in the service field of it's not first responders, but it's also not an individual response. It's a group care response. And so that's pretty much what we refer to as a secondary response. So Melissa talked about the trauma and when the brain is impacted by trauma. Our senses are taking in information, and that information is stored. And what we like to say is in a normal situation or a healthy situation, there is a beginning, middle, and end, like creating that story in your brain so that when you are going to retrieve that information, it has a beginning, middle, and end. But during trauma, that information becomes jumbled in your brain. And so when you try to recall it, your recall is different. The beginning may not come out as the beginning. So what our program does, and that's the group crisis intervention that we provide, it starts to lay the foundation of hopefully putting these pieces back together. So when you're taking in all your senses during that traumatic event, there's taste, there's smell, there's seeing, there's hearing, there's touching. All that information is still being stored during that traumatic event. And when it comes into your brain, this is sort of what it looks like. It's all jumbled together. And so as you can imagine, it's really difficult to try to recall something when it's like this in your brain. So our program, KCIT, when we do a group crisis intervention, there are 3 roles that are involved. There's a facilitator, a scribe, and a support person. So when we come in, the facilitator is there to really provide guidance and asking those questions to help participants recall things, to answer questions, and to start to put words with some of the feelings and experiences that they've had. The scribe is there to record the information. And as you imagine, there's people that are very audible people. There's also people that are very visual people. And when you're feeling or experiencing trauma, it's really important to give people abilities to access the information. So while you're going through the group crisis intervention what we're talking about, the scribe is basically writing everything the participants are saying. And it gives people the visual as well as hearing. So it taps into both, because I'm a very visual person. So when I see something, it sets in a little bit easier for me. But some people are more audible, and that's what they need to do, is hear it. And then there's a support person in every group crisis intervention. That support person's there to provide additional support if someone is triggered, if someone is emotionally charged from what they're hearing or what they're experiencing, and they need one-on-one. So we provide this service, GCIs, virtually and in person. So in person, the support person would just get up and leave and go into another room. But virtually, we provide it through a breakout room. And we do our group crisis interventions on Zoom when we do it virtually. So the facilitator. So the facilitator's really helping create that timeline by asking questions. And we start with past, like, where were you? What happened? What were you experiencing? What do you remember? Bringing them back to that day, that experience. Then we walk them to being in the present mode. Where are they now? What are they experiencing? What has changed? And then moving to the future. It's helping create that timeline like we talked about in the past, where the timeline is all mixed up. So again, the facilitator is asking, how did you experience the event? What do you remember smelling, hearing, tasting? And then walking them to the present. And the present's so important because that's what they're experiencing now. What do they notice that's different? And then walking them towards the future. How do you expect the event to impact you? Preparing them. So once the facilitator gets all that information and the scribe's writing this all down and everyone's listening to all the participants' responses, the facilitator provides what we call the educational phase. And during the educational phase, they're using all the information that's been provided and walking them through and helping them validate what they're experiencing, helping them normalize what they're experiencing. And so through that, it's a really gentle way for them to walk through the past, present, and then helping them get ready for the future, what to expect in a safe, predictable way. Now, the outcomes. I love this book, the bookshelf analogy. When we talk about the brain and how we're trying to create that beginning, middle, and end, we think of a book. A book has a beginning, middle, and end. And when you go to access something on a bookshelf and you say, oh, I want to know what happens at the end, you can just go right to the end of the book and grab that information. But when you have a brain that's on trauma and experiencing, the traumatic events and then jumping to the future, they may end up having that sense of smell, taste that is connected to that event, and it brings their brain and their body back to that moment in time. So by helping them create that beginning, middle, and end, it helps give them more control and empower them to be able to predict and be able to actually gain access or resource to that information. It also, this group crisis intervention, it allows for that connection that Melissa talks a lot about earlier, of not feeling alone through this. By listening to coworkers or neighbors or students, other peers, talk about what they're experiencing, it validates how they're feeling and what they're going through. So we're going to talk a little, I'm just going to go over an example of a recent GCI that KCIT was involved in. A domestic violence organization contacted us because a longtime client had been murdered. And I'll talk a little about why there's a question mark there. The client left the shelter and just went to the store and didn't come back. And the staff experienced disenfranchised grief. And they were feeling as though this person didn't matter enough for even law enforcement to really dig deep to find out what happened to this client. It was just written off as she just, was homeless or was into drugs and she just overdosed. And the staff felt as though there was foul play. So going back to why there's a question mark next to longtime client murdered is KCIT provides services to communities that are impacted by crime. and any type of crime. But there are some cases where it's a gray area, where it's under investigation, or while we're actually starting to explore setting up a GCI, it's determined that actually it wasn't a crime that occurred. But we also know that the staff of this organization is experiencing severe grief and are reeling from this experience. So we make sometimes decisions based on the experience of what's happening in a community to provide that service. And what was really wonderful about this was it provides not just help for the people that we're working with, the participants, but the organization, the person who's asked us for the help, it also provides them a tool. So these services were requested by the administration, but it also helped the staff feel supported and heard by the administration because they offered this help. The staff are given a safe place to discuss their feelings of frustration and anger and helplessness. And by bringing the staff together, they are able to connect on this really beautiful, just supportive level with one another. They were able to connect by hearing what each other has experienced and also to provide help and support to each other. And all this is done because it's not done by their supervisor. It's not done by the executive director or the HR. It's done through a neutral party, KCIT. And when we talk about how we move people towards the future and this path of healing, with this organization, through their discussions and through a lot of their concerns, the facilitator was able to bring them back to what's important for you. And they talked about memorializing clients that are killed or disappear, and that leaves them the sense of helplessness or hopelessness, and giving them this path of empowerment, of healing and honoring their clients. So KCIT, we provide group crisis debriefing. We also provide companioning for community vigils, memorial services, and conferences, just like we're doing for this conference this week. We're providing what's called a SelfCare room. And that SelfCare room is for anyone that's experiencing a reaction or needs some additional emotional support. And that's the kind of things that we do. We also are providing trauma-informed trainings throughout the state and technical assistance. And our services and many of our trainings are free of charge because it is provided by, we are a grant-funded program from PCCD. PCCD is a PCCD grant, and we provide many trainings through that. And when we talk about crime, it's the first time I'm looking at time, we want to make sure we have some time for questions. Basically, KCIT responds to any type of crime. And we provide care to organizations, places of employment, schools, churches, any type of community that's been thrown into crisis or grief after a crime occurs. Our team, our services are provided by trained professional volunteers, and we do this throughout the entire state of Pennsylvania. And our professional trainers, our professional volunteers are literally, they span all different diverse professional backgrounds, from victim services, first responders, social workers, grief counselors, therapists, and I'm putting a plug in, we are always looking for new volunteers. And basically what to expect with a GCI, we basically, we provide this service within a few days or a few weeks of a critical incident. It usually lasts between 1 to 3 hours. It can involve any number of people, and we group people homogeneously based on their experience, witnesses versus non-witnesses. We try to minimize the amount of trauma people experience. We don't want to mix the two, because someone that's not been exposed to that, you want to make sure that you don't increase their trauma. And how to activate us: you call, you can email us, but we need to be requested for the service, because we need a host, because this is an anonymous service. We do not collect identifying information for people, and it provides a sense of privacy and security and safety. And I'm the KCIT coordinator. I'm the one that will work with you step by step. So that's it in a really quick synopsis of KCIT. Does anyone have any questions? I know it's 10 o'clock and when people need to rush off for the keynote, but do you have any questions?
I also put our website in the chat. If you guys couldn't get our contact information quickly enough.
Also, we are more than happy to send you, if you are interested, we can send you literature about our program and our services. Thank you so much for coming today and being part of our workshop. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Yep, and if you guys need us for anything, you reach out. Like we said, we're all over the state of Pennsylvania. Thank you. Thanks, Heather. All right.